I wasn't born into tragedy, but I wasn't born into privilege either. I was simply a man from Detroit. A son, a brother, a husband once and always, a dreamer. My life was ordinary, filled with work, family, and the noise of a city that never slept. I never imagined my name would one day be tied to injustice, remembered only as Richard Phillips, wrongly imprisoned for 47 years. Detroit, in the late 1960s and early 70s, was alive. Factories pounding, cars rolling off assembly lines, Motown drifting through the air. People worked hard, struggled, and laughed when they could. I was no different. I wasn't perfect, but I wasn't a criminal. I didn't carry a gun or take from others. I had a family, children, love and hope for the future. But everything changed on what seemed like an ordinary day. The police came without warning, pounding at my door. When I opened it, they told me I was under arrest for the murder of Gregory Harris, a name I had never heard in my life. I thought it had to be a mistake, maybe even a cruel joke. But when the cold steel cuffs closed around my wrists, I realized no one was laughing. There was no weapon, no fingerprints, no motive, only the word of one man trying to cut a deal for himself. Yet that was all the system needed. My lawyer barely looked at me, the jury barely heard me, and the judge sealed my fate with just a few words. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. In that instant, my world collapsed. The pain wasn't just losing freedom. It was telling my child I wasn't coming home, watching my mother cry, and feeling powerless behind bars. What they stole wasn't only my body, but my future, my before, my possibility. And so began a sentence that would stretch longer than most lifetimes. A journey through despair I never thought I'd survive. You don't feel the fall until you hit bottom. And for me, the sound that marked that fall was the single click of handcuffs. It's the small thing trauma etches into you. Not always the shouting or the tears, but that one final sound that makes everything real. They arrested me like I was already guilty. No questions, no chance to explain. Just orders, a slam, and a ride that turned me from Richard, the man who fixed cars, watched Tigers games, and made his kids laugh, into Richard Phillips, murder suspect. The interrogation room was the kind they used to unmake people. Yellow walls, a buzzing light, a pressure that feels designed to make your thoughts fray. They accused me, pressed me, asked why my fingerprints were on a car and where I was the night Gregory Harris was killed. I asked for a lawyer. I insisted I didn't know the man. My words slid off them like water off glass. What finally did it was a setup. A man named Fred Mitchell, someone I barely knew, gave my name to police in exchange for mercy. He said I helped kill Gregory Harris. He lied. He had every reason to. The cops needed a story, and I fit the part. A black man in 1970s Detroit. That was enough. The trial wasn't about truth. It was about the story they could tell. They painted me violent, tied me to gangs, made the narrative stick. My public defender hardly defended me. He didn't investigate, didn't challenge, barely reviewed the file. The jury, 12 strangers with no connection to me, believed the version laid out in court. The judge's sentence was a single, devastating line. Life without the possibility of parole. My legs gave out as they led me away. I looked back and saw my mother crying. That image followed me for decades. Prison began as erasure. They stripped me of name and clothes, gave me a number, a gray uniform, a thin mattress, and a cell that smelled of bleach and defeat. I whispered the same prayer. This isn't real. They'll fix it. They'll let me go. Until those words stopped being enough. They locked up my body, but they were after my soul. Prison was colder and emptier than I imagined. No fire and brimstone, just gray silence that squeezed the life out of you. The first blow was the weight of it all. Metal doors slamming, hard stairs, and the endless echo of the sentence, "Never going home." They gave me a number 957, wait, and that number slowly replaced my name. Survival meant learning unwritten rules fast. Don't look too long, don't cry, don't trust. I fought when I had to, not because I wanted to, but because softness was a target. Time inside twisted into a weapon, days stretching into months, years melting into a blur, yet the first 5 years stayed painfully vivid. Every meal, every lockdown, every insult across the yard. I watched men quietly give up, stop writing, stop speaking, stop living, and I swore I wouldn't let that happen to me. Still the cracks began. Hope lived in small rebellions. I wrote hundreds of letters, to lawyers, to anyone who might listen, mostly unanswered. Each returned silence like another shovel of dirt. And then there was art. What began as doodles on legal pads grew into serious drawing, faces, doors, light and shadow. Art became my escape and my purpose. For a little while inside a sketch I could be someone else. But the haunting never left. Gregory Harris's death chained me to the place, and the thought that someone out there knew the truth but didn't act sat on my chest every night. Even so, I kept getting up, because somewhere inside me a stubborn belief remained. One day the truth would rise. Sometimes justice doesn't roar, it whispers. After more than 20 years inside, the first crack in my world came not from a riot or a lawyer's filing, but from a rumor in the yard, someone muttering that Fred Mitchell, the man whose lie put me here, was now saying he'd made things up. That tiny whisper hit like lightning. Hope in prison is dangerous. It makes you vulnerable. I didn't leap at the rumor. I listened, asked quietly, and over months the fragments added up. Fred had been talking, guilt gnawing at him, and people were starting to pay attention. Still, a rumor wasn't proof. Things changed in 2010 when I was moved to another facility and met Richard Palumbo, a man who claimed he'd been there the night Gregory Harris died, and that it wasn't me. He said Fred lied. He didn't want money or favors. He said he was tired of watching an innocent man rot. His confession cracked something open inside me that had been frozen for decades. But one witness and whispers aren't enough. I had to push, write differently, and give my words evidence. The Innocence Clinic at the University of Michigan answered, a group willing to dig through transcripts and test the story against fact. What they found was what I'd been saying for years. No physical evidence, no forensic link, and a conviction built on a single false testimony. The system pushed back, but the motions began. Judges re-examined the file. Fred Mitchell was called again. He no longer denied it. Piece by piece, the case began to unravel. The hardest part wasn't surviving prison. It was seeing how easily the system had discarded me, designed to punish the poor and silence black men. I wasn't a fluke. I was exactly what the system expected. Yet the cracks widened. After 45 years, for the first time, daylight felt possible. It was faint, buried under paper and history, but it existed. A whisper had become a voice, and that voice began to pull at the bars. They stole decades from me and handed back minutes. After decades of momentum toward justice, progress finally arrived, but it moved like syrup, slow, sticky, and relentless. For the first time in 45 years, I had leverage, testimony, cracked witnesses, and lawyers willing to turn gossip into motions. But winning required mountains of paperwork, perfect timing, and legal precision. Freedom wasn't a key, it was a brief. The Innocence Clinic dug through transcripts, reassembled timelines, and exposed holes big enough to sink the original story. Fred Mitchell had broken. Richard Palumbo had come forward. Still, even when the truth was plain, the system dripped answers in years, not days. Preparing to leave after so long was more like training for another life than celebrating. I wasn't simply excited, I was terrified. The world had changed. Chords became invisible, music moved from records to invisible streams, and people carried glowing screens. I went into prison as a young man and came out decades later, a 70-something with a bad hip and no idea how to use an ATM. So I read, drew, and practiced living in the only ways I could. The last days inside were quiet rituals, packing a few books and sketches, giving away small things, walking the yard slowly to memorize the sound of my steps. On the final night I lay awake, not afraid, but hollow, waiting. Release was abrupt and unceremonious. They gave me donated clothes, a bus check, and a farewell with no apology. The morning air felt enormous. There were no family greetings, no safety net, no government care, only a cot from a church, couches, and the kindness of strangers at a soup kitchen. Reintegration wasn't a program. It was survival in a world that had evolved without me. Art became the bridge back. I poured the lost years into canvases, cell blocks and sunsets, eyes behind bars, hands clutching hope. A local gallery noticed. People came, and for the first time in 47 years, I felt seen. Eventually, Michigan awarded $1.5 million in compensation, a headline that meant little against the cost of missed funerals, weddings, and mournings with loved ones. Money could not buy decades back. It only underscored the fundamental question left by 47 stolen years. What is time worth? The answer remained a quiet, unmeasurable absence. They freed my body, but I had to rescue myself. Walking out of prison didn't mean instant freedom. The bars were gone, but I was still caged by trauma, loss, and decades of being unseen. At 26, I had entered with youth, laughter, and sideburns. At 73, I stepped out with gray hair, aching bones, and a city I no longer recognized. The man who went in did not make it out. I had to build a new version of myself from what remained. Learning trust again was one of the hardest lessons. Prison had trained me to sleep light, keep my back to the wall, and doubt every kindness. Even a stranger handing me coffee felt suspicious. Not because I thought it was poisoned, but because I had forgotten what it meant to be treated with simple humanity. I studied the world like a child. I watched kids with earbuds, elders swiping cards instead of cash, teenagers recording themselves for audiences I couldn't see. I learned how to cook with a microwave, how to use a smartphone, how to fill out job applications online. Each small lesson was a victory, a way of saying, "You didn't break me." People asked if I was angry. The truth, anger was easy, but it would have kept me chained. I chose not to be bitter. I was tired, grieving, scarred, but not angry. Because if I let anger define me, prison would still own me. As my story spread from local papers to national news, I became more than an exonerated man. I became proof. Proof that the system fails. Proof that race still decides guilt. Proof that light can cut through decades of darkness. Speaking at colleges, meeting law students, and embracing families with loved ones inside gave my pain purpose. But the ghosts remain. Some nights, I still wake in a cold sweat, believing I am back in a cell, I see the faces of men left behind, innocent or guilty, but all human. They walk with me in memory, in art, in every handshake, and welcome back. They took everything from me and never said sorry. I waited for one small thing, a word that would make the wrong right. Sorry. It never came. Not from the judge, not from the prosecutor, not from Fred Mitchell, who pointed at me in court and sealed my fate. Instead, there was silence, the machine of the justice system moving on without conscience. The system wasn't personal. It was a mechanism of paper, power, and politics that chewed people up and kept going. My exoneration arrived quietly. A form, a judge's stamp, a signature, yet still no apology. That absence hollowed out more than the sentence ever did. People ask if I forgave the man who lied. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't for him. It was for me. Fred never apologized, but I let go of bitterness because carrying it would only continue the punishment. I forgave not because he earned it, but because I needed to live. Michigan eventually passed compensation, $50,000 per year, which for 47 years totaled $2,150,000. Even that came wrapped in bureaucracy, delays, fights over technicalities, and the indignity of proving worthiness for money after being robbed of decades. When the check finally arrived, it didn't restore my lost years or the funerals and weddings I missed. It was survival, not redemption. What cut deepest was the silence of others, the jurors, officials, and gatekeepers who watched or handled the process and did nothing. Their indifference hurt more than any sentence. Left without apologies from the outside, I learned to forgive myself for perceived failures and to celebrate the stubborn things I did right. Writing letters, refusing to break, keeping the truth. So what is justice now? Not vindication in headlines or full restitution for time lost. For me it's smaller. A room of my own, meals I cook, paintings that speak what courts could not, young lawyers inspired by my story, and quiet moments where I'm seen as a person again, not a number. Justice arrived late and fragile, but I still choose to believe in it, because if I don't, then who will? They set me free, but I left pieces of myself behind. Freedom didn't wipe prison away. It clung to me, in silence, in memory, in the faces of men who would never walk out. The heaviest thing I carried wasn't pain, but remembrance of those left behind, men still waiting for someone to believe them. They weren't just inmates. Inside, people are more complicated than guilty or innocent. I met men who had harmed, yes, but also men who recited poetry at night, who shared food when you were sick, who wept at letters from daughters. One taught me shading with a dull pencil. Another cooked miracles from noodles and beans. Another knew the Constitution better than lawyers and guided my first motion. Guilty or not, all were trapped, and all were human. The forgotten ones suffered most. Some had no family, no letters, no visits. One said, "It's like I died, but nobody bothered to bury me." To fight that erasure, I drew them, faces, stories, regrets, love that outlived confinement. I called the series Portraits of the Forgotten. Each sketch was more than art. It was recognition. You matter. I see you. When I was released, cameras and headlines focused on me, man freed after 47 years. But I refused to only tell my story. I spoke about Antonio, who had evidence of innocence but no lawyer. Malik, who confessed at 16 under beatings. Wallace, who died 2 weeks before his appeal was approved. The world celebrated my survival but ignored their struggle. My voice became theirs, though too often unheard. Art became resistance. My canvases showed hands gripping bars, Fathers aging behind walls, sons growing up through glass. Some viewers said, "It's hard to look at." Good. It should be. Because the system thrives on comfort and silence. If my work makes someone stop and ask, "Why is this still happening?" then I've done my part. The truth is bitter. Wrongful convictions persist because there's no cost for getting it wrong. Prosecutors build careers, detectives retire with pensions, while men like me lose decades and receive nothing more than a check. That isn't justice, it's arithmetic. I don't want pity, I want change. Why are single, self-serving testimonies still enough to convict? Why isn't there a system to review old cases? Why is it so hard for cries from behind steel to be heard? These are simple questions, but they demand compassion. So I keep painting. At 4 a.m., when the ghosts wake me, I draw to keep memories alive. Some men I sketch are already gone. Others will never see freedom, but in my lines they live again, with names, faces, dignity. As long as I can hold a brush, they will not be forgotten. After 47 years, walking out didn't feel like stepping into sunshine and credits rolling. It felt like being dropped into a foreign land where I no longer spoke the language. The world had moved on without me, and I had to relearn how to live in it. The first time I held a smartphone, I turned it over like it was a strange piece of magic. No buttons, no cords, just a glowing screen. I didn't know how to swipe, answer a call, or what an app even was. That's when it hit me. I was 73 years old, a man decades out of step with his own time. I had to relearn everything, riding buses, opening bank accounts, paying with cards, even how to speak to strangers without sounding lost. Freedom carried old instincts. After years of scanning my back, sleeping light, and reading every tone of voice, I couldn't walk down the street without flinching. I kept my back to walls, sat where I could see the door, froze when sirens wailed. It took years to unlearn survival and start trusting the world wasn't out to crush me anymore. The first night in my own room nearly broke me. I thought it would feel like heaven, but the silence was overwhelming. Too wide, too deep. I lay awake, blanket pulled to my chin, heart racing. It was the first time in decades I had space, but I didn't yet know how to rest in it. Joy felt fragile. My first real meal brought tears. Seasoned chicken, rice with life in it, greens on a plate instead of a tray. I ate slowly, afraid it would vanish. Joy, after so long, felt awkward, but I held it anyway. Laughter returned, too. Real laughter, the kind that left me breathless. A silly sitcom broke me open, and I laughed until I cried. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just surviving, I was living again. Freedom also gave space for grief. In prison, mourning made you vulnerable, so I buried it. Outside, grief came like a flood. My mother gone, my brother too. My children grown without me, my wife remarried. I wept for the people I'd lost, but also for the time that evaporated. Holidays, birthdays, hugs that never came. And yet the beauty of freedom lived in small things. Feeling grass underfoot, choosing dinner, watching the sky without fences. Freedom wasn't grand gestures or justice delivered. It was choice. After decades without it, the ability to wake up and decide how to spend a day, whether painting, walking, or just sipping coffee in the sun, was everything. I had been invisible for 47 years. Now, even with grief, even with scars, I wasn't afraid to feel, to laugh, to cry, to be seen. That is what freedom really feels like. Sometimes I sit in the quiet of morning and ask myself, what if Richard Palumbo had stayed silent? What if the Innocence Clinic never opened my letter? What if no one listened? The answer is simple. I'd be dead by now, buried behind prison walls. Another number forgotten, another life erased by silence. My coffin would have been a cell, a 6x9 concrete box, barred windows for sky, bleach and rust for air, the sound of keys as my final music. They would have written natural causes on the report. But that would have been a lie. I would have died of neglect, of invisibility, of a country that looked away. My art would have vanished with me. The sketches I hid, the portraits of sorrow and memory, would have been swept into the trash the day my cell was reassigned. No gallery, no voice, no proof that I'd seen the humanity in men the world discarded. Just another inmate who did his time. Though none of it was his, my name would have disappeared. Richard Phillips, a man turned into weight, would have faded without meaning. No headlines, no interviews, no acknowledgement of being the longest wrongful conviction in U.S. history. Because history forgets the silenced. It only remembers the few who make it back. I was almost not one of them. Even Gregory Harris, the man whose murder I was blamed for, would have been denied justice. His family would have lived with a false closure, never knowing the truth, never seeing the real killer answer for it. They might have even believed I deserved to die in that cell. There were nights I thought about ending it. Nights when the weight of concrete and time pressed too heavy. I never told anyone, because weakness is dangerous currency inside. But I'd stare at the walls and wonder if disappearing would be easier. What stopped me was something fierce and stubborn. Maybe hope, maybe rage. I couldn't give them the satisfaction of my silence. So I stayed. I lived, barely. They almost buried me alive, but I clawed my way back with nothing but truth and a pencil. Even free, I live in a shadow world. One version of me died in prison. Another lived to tell the story. Both are real. Both carry the weight. And if I had never been freed, you wouldn't be reading this. I wouldn't be speaking to students about the cracks in the system, painting the forgotten, or standing in the sun unafraid of passing eyes. The story would have ended before it began, but I was freed. And because of that, I owe a debt to those still inside, to those who will never walk out. I made it out of the fire. Now, I carry the torch for the ones still burning.